Actually, that's
So we got Mark Anderson.
Guess I better make sure everybody could hear me. So we got Mark Anderson, former USGS employee and educator, consultant, general person who knows a lot of information about the Black Hills and Black Hills area, and as well as Western United States. He's going to talk to us today about the subject of groundwater.
Hey, Mark, you should be hooked up.
okay. You're able to hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks, Craig, for the invitation to talk about groundwater. It's kind of one of my favorite subjects. So, great to be able to speak with people interested in water, not only at the West Dakota, but also there in the audience. So, I think I'll share my screen and see how that goes. I'll go back to the beginning. See if I can make it a little bigger. All right, should be able to see this Madison Spring, I guess. Not hearing a response, so I presume you're seeing that.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, we can see that.
Okay. All right, so we'll be talking a little bit about groundwater. This is the Madison Spring headwaters of Little Spearfish Creek, and I'm going to talk about groundwater hidden resource and how we can actually do a better job today of figuring out how to manage it sustainably. So briefly, I was going to talk a little bit about the legal environment, how groundwater is different than surface water. I'll give a few examples of where things have gone sour around the West mainly. I got to sprinkle in a few groundwater principles, and then we'll talk about sustainable management of the groundwater resource and how it applies to the Black Hills. So the evolution, if you will, of groundwater law came much after surface water law. So most of the thinking 100 years ago was that groundwater was so secret, occult, and concealed that any attempt to administer any set of legal rules would be involved in hopeless uncertainty and would therefore be practically impossible. This was pretty much the thinking in the early days about groundwater. So a lot of aspects of groundwater has grown up basically without really any constraints. And you'll probably hear about Texas. This is the so-called rule of capture, and also known as the law of the biggest pump. The court found that a landowner has the right to pump all the water he can from beneath his land, regardless of the effect on other wells and adjacent owners. That law is still in effect for much of the High Plains Aquifer. So this is the map of the United States where groundwater depletion has occurred. You'll see that Texas has anywhere from 150 to 400 feet of water level declines. But I'd also draw your attention to South Dakota. Pretty much all of South Dakota has experienced, quite a bit of, I shouldn't say quite a bit, but experienced drawdown in the groundwater resources anywhere from 10 to 25 feet. And more than that in the High Plains Aquifer there in the southern part of the south central part of the state. And this is another way to look at it. This is the declines in the state of South Dakota, much just to the east of the Black Hills. So we're not immune from groundwater depletion. But the science of geohydrology has advanced now. I guess we don't necessarily have to think about it as being a separate resource. There's a couple of USGS reports that are significant in this matter. One is groundwater and surface water, a single resource, and I'll talk a little bit about that here in a couple slides, and then also the sustainability of groundwater resources. So there is context now to understand better that the groundwater resources need to be managed in conjunction with surface water. So one of the concepts I'm going to introduce today is this idea that depletion of a small part of the total volume of water in storage can have large effects on surface water. So you don't have to deplete all the storage in a reservoir or an aquifer system to see some adverse consequences of pumping, such as water quality and subsidence, can limit development. I just put some examples up here where they're coping with difficulties with groundwater depletion. I'll mention Santa Fe. Santa Fe has I'm getting some feedback. Is that from me, or I hope you can hear me all right? But
I don't know. I think everybody can hear you. Yeah, we can hear you fine. Seeing a little of that too. I'm not sure where it's coming from.
okay. Okay, so Santa Fe is in kind of a tough spot as a city. And they've established a watershed area, which in fact is probably the most complex water system or watershed drainage and so forth in the United States. But they have areas where if you own land and it's vacant land and you want to build a house on it, you can't drill a well, a domestic well. That's unusual. So if you want to build on some land, vacant land, you got to find a neighboring property you can buy and be able to have their well too. So, and the Upper San Pedro is an interesting one. Totally, two towns, Sierra Vista and Fort Huachuca, are totally dependent on groundwater. Fort Huachuca is an Army base, and unfortunately, groundwater pumping is depleting the flow of the river. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Edwards Aquifer too. So plenty of examples around the West of where groundwater pumping has caused depletion and storage and then had adverse effects like diminishing flow in springs in the Edwards Aquifer. So this is the Edwards Aquifer. There is a nonprofit group called the Greater Edwards Aquifer Alliance. And they're suffering also from this idea of rule of capture, meaning so-called law of the biggest pump. But Edwards Aquifer provides drinking water to 1.7 million people, and it's continuing to grow. And current pumping from the aquifer has resulted in diminished spring flows in San Antonio. So that's a picture of one of the springs that discharge. And these are all the springs that discharge from the Edwards Aquifer that in many cases are diminishing in flow. So another example, this is the High Plains Aquifer a little further south in Nebraska and Kansas. The big, orange splotches are the depletion of groundwater, mainly from pumping for irrigation and agricultural use. And that pumping depletion has caused the flow in the river. These upside down triangles are stream flow gauges along the Republican and the Smoky Hill River that have shown declining discharge over the last 60 years. One thing you may not be readily available or informed about is this is a figure from one of my reports, and what it shows is the age or the time since recharge for the water that's being pumped from many of these groundwater aquifer systems. And so one of the ones that I worked on was the N aquifer there in northern Arizona. And the water that's being pumped is anywhere from 10 to 30,000 years old, which means that there's relatively little modern recharge. So storage is being depleted, and Same way with the Tucson Basin. Anyway, so you can see around even in the high plains, some of the water that's being pumped is old water instead of relatively new water from recharge. So this is a common problem. Groundwater is being depleted from many of the aquifers in the West. So a little bit of groundwater budget terms in the simplest way we can illustrate it. You can imagine that this is a aquifer and water comes into it, of course, from recharge, and some water leaves by discharge. And this is kind of the simplest water budget we can have. And then, of course, you have some pumpage that's being removed. Well, if pumpage exceeds recharge and the outflow, then storage is depleted. And one of the things, these are difficult terms to measure, of course, recharge. So one of the ways you can get at that is to measure storage, meaning if storage is being depleted, then you know that your water budget is out of balance. I won't go into much more detail on that right now. I want to also introduce another concept that might not be readily recognized by a lot of folks. It's the so-called water budget myth. This has been around for a while, but let me read kind of the most important part of it. It's one of the most common misconceptions in groundwater hydrology is that a water budget of an area determines the magnitude of possible groundwater development. Several well-known hydrologists have addressed this misconception and attempted to dispel it. Somehow, though, it persists and continues to color decisions by the water management community. Laws governing development of groundwater are based on this idea that pumping within a groundwater basin shall not exceed recharge. So in another way, this is often called safe yield. It's also referred to as groundwater mining if you pump more than recharge. But the point is that there can be consequences of pumping equal to recharge. So a simple illustration of this, you can imagine a groundwater aquifer, and I'm using the analogy of a reservoir. So in this case, inflow to the reservoir, and this is our storage, and outflow equals, and so we have a stream that's healthy, so to speak, and you also have a riparian system. But if you have pumping from this storage reservoir that's equal to inflows or recharge, then you have no outflow. And so, this would be considered safe yield, right? Well, the point is that with no outflow, you're going to have some kind of some consequences downstream. And so the way you can call the fact that you have a sustained pumping from an aquifer is if the pumping arrow, the amount that's being removed, is less than recharge. So that arrow and that arrow can equal that arrow. So now you may have a smaller discharge out of the system, but you can call it sustained yield if the consequences are acceptable. In other words, everybody's, well, I can live with a smaller riparian system, or I can live with a seasonally lower flow in the river or something. So, so that's kind of a quick idea, a concept about sustained yield. This is another way to look at it. You have a steady state system hasn't been pumped before, and so then you have this depletion period, and so what you have is this deficit of groundwater storage. And if you can shut off the pumps, then the storage component will begin to recover. And if you have a cessation of pumping, eventually it'll get back to here. But if you have still continued some pumping and you're showing some recovery, and again, if there's not undesirable consequences, you can call that sustained use. Wanted to illustrate kind of two ways that groundwater pumping can affect a stream or a spring. The first one is kind of by direct withdrawal. This is a pump that would be located in sometimes called Holocene alluvium or tertiary alluvium, relatively recent sands and gravels along the stream. And I have an illustration in a minute on that. This was established, and other states have followed it. It was so-called Goodfarb decision out of the Supreme Court, Arizona. It said basically, if you're pumping from here, you're pumping the creek. And Rapid City has followed that. The galleries, for example, when they had Meadowbrook and still have Girl Scout Gallery, the pumping from those galleries, even though it's coming from the gravels, is considered to be pumping directly from the creek. So they have a replacement clause on that. The other one is this idea of pumping from a regional aquifer well. It doesn't directly grab water from the capture flow from the stream, but what happens is this water that's removed is intercepted, or it never makes it to the stream. So I'll show an example of that. Kind of a important decision in groundwater law was the city of Albuquerque wanted to drill several large wells along the Front Range there, and this is the Rio Grande River. They wanted to pump 1,500 acre feet per year. Reynolds was the state engineer at the time, and he said, no, I'm going to deny that because I think it's going to eventually affect the Rio Grande River. And so I went to the state Supreme Court, and Reynolds prevailed. In other words, he was able to make the case that this well, even though it's in the regional system, was going to affect the Rio Grande River. So this is the way it works for one that's capturing flow directly from the stream. You can start off with flow paths going to the stream, and then with pumping, you can actually reverse the flow from the stream to the well. So that's stream flow capture. Okay, everybody's familiar with this slide, I'm sure. But I wanted to illustrate one thing, and that is that everyone's familiar with all the springs we have around the Black Hills, particularly, as they come out of the canyons. And but what we have with the situation with the Madison is that the water that comes to the land surface, like at Jackson Springs and by Sturgis and Spearfish and so forth, is rejected recharge. This is water that the Madison, and to a lesser extent the Minaloosa, but mainly we're focusing on the Madison. It just can't accept it. It's basically full. So at some point, if head declines, like this dash line, you don't have to remove large volumes of water from storage to be able to have undesirable effects. So back to that groundwater water budget myth issue, you can just reduce the head, and if the head is reduced enough, you can diminish the flow. So I'll show a couple of examples of that. Arden Davis and I gave a presentation at the hydrology conference and just kind of looked at the amount of head decline that was in some of the observation wells around the Black Hills for just a relatively short period, 4 or 5 years of below average precipitation produced. In this well, 72 feet of head decline. This one near Tilford produced 80 feet of head decline. And then some people probably remember this one, the observation well. These are operated by the state, by the way. This well headed by Reptile Gardens had a head decline of 134 feet. That's pretty significant, obviously. So the point is that Madison head against the hills is vulnerable to reductions in inflow, but also pumping. Many people have seen this, and maybe it's become trite, but this is the observation well at Jackson Springs site, and it back in 2007, 2008, reached a head above land surface of only about 10 feet. So if this had continued down and lost another 10 feet ahead, this spring would have certainly diminished in flow a lot, if not stopped at all. Fortunately, today it's recovered quite a bit. This is the minimum it reached back in 2008, has recovered, but it does have these ventures down where the head decline does exist. So this is obviously a really important and key spring for us here in Rapid City area and around the Black Hills. These are all the cities or communities that have wells into the Madison limestone, both here in South Dakota as well as over in Wyoming. And this is just a graph that shows the cumulative number of wells. It isn't volume, it's just the number of wells that have been drilled into the Madison. I illustrate this for especially Meade and Pennington County, is that in the sweep of history, the development of the Madison is relatively recent. I mean, we're talking about something that's largely since 1980 or so. So when we had the kind of drought of the late 80s. So kind of the big issue for me that I think we need to pay attention to is until there's some other alternative sources of water, whether it's a pipeline, I don't know, or other ways of acquiring some water for the area, it's going to be the Madison is the place where that growth will be supported. I wanted to take just a moment to, I think do I still have a couple of minutes, Craig, or?
Yeah, you're getting real close to our 40-minute limit here. So
40 minutes.
Well, no, the Zoom meeting has a 40-minute limit.
Oh, I see. But this is, if I can get it going right, this is only a couple of minutes.
Yeah, you should be fine, but it's close to.
Okay, can you see this now, or do I need to?
Good, buddy. Yeah, we can see that.
Okay. So this is a documentary called Pumped Dry, and there's a couple of just phrases I was wanting to have you listen to.
We can't do this and that, but that's what we do. That's how groundwater has been managed.
We pretended groundwater was some separate part of the system that we could ignore. We can't ignore it any longer.
We had audio and then we lost it.
Oh,
Of California.
Is there a hidden
you don't have any audio now?
Well, it's popping in and out.
Well,
camera spying on you right now?
I got these darn ads that jump
What I
in here.
say,
Yeah, is a highly productive agricultural area.
It's working.
Now we
Gotta try to get them.
and see what.
Ah,
A very large influx of vineyards planted in the area, lots and lots and lots of wine grapes, which has been a spectacular thing for our economy. I can't downplay that. But as a rural resident, I found myself personally getting very worried back in the early 90s even that this supposedly endless aquifer that we sat over, that we were assured would last forever when we bought our place, would be endangered.
My well's dry for 2 years already. Okay, ready? Let's go.
well, anyway, were you able to hear that or not?
Yeah, parts of it there we did.
Okay, well, you can look at it later, but basically great quote. She said, "We thought this aquifer was an endless supply and would last forever." That's a common sort of approach to things. And then this is my last slide. I guess I got to go back and anyway, so my final message is let's don't assume the Madison Act will always be there, meaning, of course, the formation will be there, but I mean, the available supply can easily go the way of many other aquifers throughout the West if we don't carefully manage it. The tools exist today to manage it, to avert the depletion problems so prevalent in the West. This means monitoring storage change. It means modeling, which I know the USGS is proposing to do. So there are the tools. It's not the secret, occult, unmanageable resource that we used to talk about. And but there will be the need to examine additional water supply strategies to sustain ecosystems and population growth. Can't just rely on the Madison. So that's my story, Craig.
Okay, I think we have a few minutes for questions if somebody has one. Okay. No questions.
No question.
Must have been persuasive.
Thank you very much.
All right. Talk to you later. Have a great meeting.
Yeah. You too. Bye.
We're gonna take a 15-minute break.